Erev Tov, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the fifth installment in this series on Israel's prime ministers that we're calling The Buck Stops Here, which we are doing in collaboration with a department of the Prime Minister's Office, which deals with the commemorations of Israel's prime ministers and presidents. For those of you watching this in the recording on YouTube, then please subscribe, and if you're in Jerusalem, then come to the next one in person, and you can actually ask a question and see our wonderful guests face to face. Our wonderful guest on this occasion is Itamar Rabinovich, who is Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University and a former president of that university. He was Israel's ambassador to Washington during the tenure of Yitzhak Rabin, Rabin's second tenure as prime minister, and he was chief negotiator with Syria. His biography of Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin, Soldier, Leader, Statesman, won the Washington Institute's 2017 Book Prize. His most recent books are Middle Eastern Maze and co-written with Carmit Valenci, Syria in Revolution, the Civil War and the Fall of the Assads. He is president of the Dan David Foundation, deputy chair of the INSS think tank, and senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Itamar Rabinovich, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Those of you who've attended these before will know that in some cases we're fortunate to have a guest who actually knew the subject personally. That is the case here as well. So before we get into some of the details about Yitzhak Rabin, I'd just like to ask you, you were appointed ambassador, I think, in 93 by Rabin.
No, 92, actually.
92.
Summer of 92.
Summer
no.
92, right. Yeah. So not long after Rabin was re-elected. And did you know him personally before that? What did you have a relationship with him before that?
Yeah. First, I met Rabin. I'm not sure he remembered it, but I did. When I was a lieutenant in the research branch of the military intelligence in the early 1960s, mid-1960s, particularly the years 63 to 67, led to the Six-Day War. I was most of the time head of the Syrian and Lebanese desk in research, and there were a lot of incidents that eventually led to the crisis of May 67 and to the war. And a couple of times I was sent to brief the chief of staff, who was Rabin. This will not happen today. Today, the IDF and military intelligence became very large, cumbersome organizations, not for the good. It was a much leaner organization at the time, and a lieutenant could go and see the chief of staff. That did not seem like a big drama, and so a couple of times I remembered, I'm not sure he did. And later on, we met in the 90s, or late 80s and 90s, 80s actually, when Labour and Rabin and Peres were in the opposition, and they looked for briefings on what was going on. I was at the time at Tel Aviv University at the Shiloach Institute, which became the Dayan Center, and I used to meet with them in order to brief them, and so became friendly with both of them, which sounds a bit ironic now, but friendly with both of them. And eventually, we also began to meet the Rabins socially in other people's homes, and they invited us, and we invited them. So it became sort of a superficial social friendship, not a real friendship. And then once I started to work with him, and I'd like to share a story with you and the audience about how he recruited me. We began to work together, and in no time, we became very close and very friendly. So that's how it developed. Now, how did Rabin recruit me? Well, the issue of going to Washington as ambassador actually came up for me in the 1980s, in 87. If you remember, there was a national unity government at the time, and it was the privilege of the foreign minister to nominate and for the prime minister to approve ambassadors in Washington and the UN. So Peres, for instance, Shamir nominated Netanyahu to be ambassador to the UN, and Peres agreed. Then they could not agree on a new ambassador in Washington for several months. And one day, I received a phone call saying that today there was another meeting between Peres and Shamir, and Peres raised three names, and the only one Shamir did not reject offhand was yours. Okay, so great beginning. I went to see both Peres and Shamir and decided that I shouldn't go because there was no point in going to Washington as the foreign minister's ambassador. You really have to be the prime minister's ambassador in order to be a real ambassador in Washington.
And just to clarify, this is at the point when Shamir is prime minister and Peres is
foreign minister. And I also consulted with Rabin, who thought I should go and decided not to go, and that was it for a few years. Yossi Beilin then told me, you must be crazy. I mean, this is once in a lifetime opportunity. But then Rabin is elected prime minister in 92 and invites me to meet him at home. He was not great small talk. So I sit down and he said, you know, my most important problem is I need to replace the chief negotiator with Syria, with Yossi Ben Aaron. And he said, I'm looking for someone who, public figure who knows Syria. Can you think of someone? Now, that was awkward, because I can think of myself. So I said, well, maybe I could think of two names. He said, I'm only interested in one. So I said, I'd be very happy to do it. Oh, I'm so relieved. And this is how it happened. And then he told me, we'll talk about other things later. Other things meant the Washington embassy, clearly. He waited until November when Clinton was elected. And then he told me, okay, I'd also like you to be ambassador in Washington. But we began to work as chief negotiator with Syria, and he was the prime minister, and as prime minister, in charge of the peace process. I mean, it's the privilege or prerogative of the prime minister to conduct, first of all, the relationship with Washington. It's not the foreign ministers. And secondly, the peace process, when there is one, is for the prime minister, not for the foreign minister. So in both these capacities, we worked very closely together. And at the time, it was the negotiation with Syria. So we started to work very, very closely together.
Wow. Okay. Let's go back a little bit because your biography is called Soldier, Leader, Statesman. And obviously the soldier bit refers to Rabin's long military career, beginning with his time in the Palmach and then on to the IDF and becoming chief of staff of the IDF. How would you define what it meant, how the impact that his involvement in the IDF and the Israeli military had on him as a person and as a leader? What made it such a formative experience for him, do you think?
First of all, it was a long experience. I mean, it began in the early 40s and lasted to the mid-60s. So spent many years in the military. He was a soldier, an officer, an outstanding planner, very good in instruction. He built the instruction system for the IDF. You know, there was a time when I considered the structure of the biography. For a while, I thought maybe I should build it around his relationship with several persons: Ben Gurion, Moshe Dayan, Eshkol, Peres, and so forth, because each of these relationships was very important. It could have been an interesting structure and story for a book. Ended up not doing that. But he was Yigal Allon's basically deputy assistant. Allon immediately identified his abilities and made him his chief assistant. And he grew up with Yigal Allon from being in the Palmach to ultimately, during the War of Independence, being under Allon, who commanded the Southern Front and liberated the Negev and actually entered the Sinai. He was his right-hand man in that regard. Ended the War of Independence as highly regarded senior officer. Actually, most of the Palmach officers did not stay in the IDF. Ben-Gurion did not treat them very well, and most of them left. He was one of the few who stayed.
Right. This was a legacy of the political divides on the left, right, with Mapai on one hand and Ahadut Avodah on the other.
And Shomer Hatzayir on the other. And there's a famous incident which had a lasting influence. When Ben-Gurion did two things, because Ben-Gurion was a great believer in mamlachtiyut, the notion of state. There is not exact translation into English, but being stately.
Yeah, the country, national interest.
He said it was after so many years of non-existence as a nation and as a state, the Jews had to get used to the idea that there was a state, there was authority, and one had to live with it. And therefore, anyone who did not accept that authority had to be disbanded. So, first of all, he disbanded the Palmach, and secondly, he sank the Altalena. There had to be one authority in the state, or there would be no state. So there was a sort of a demonstration by the Palmach after it was disbanded, and Rabin planned to go. This was his friends, comrades. Ben-Gurion did not want him to go, since he was in active service. So he invited him home in the afternoon, late afternoon, and it was getting a bit late, and Rabin said, "I'm sorry, I have to leave." And Ben-Gurion said, "Maybe you should stay here and Paula will cook us dinner." No, he said, "I have to leave." And he never forgave him for, in a way, disobeying. When he told him in the late 60s, late 50s, that he was going to be chief of staff, he told him, "I have two reservations. One is that you disobeyed, and the second is that you are a bit, how should I say, difficult in making decisions. You take your time."
Indecisive.
Cautious. Chashashan, yeah. Chashashan.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Apprehensive,
yeah. But other than that, you should be the chief of staff. And when Ben-Gurion quit, he told Eshkol that I promised Rabin that he would be chief of staff, and I'm asking you to respect that. So he was made chief of staff.
It's interesting because Rabin was from the other side. He was from that Yigal Allon Palmach side that was not, he wasn't in the Dayan Perez camp.
Right.
So it's interesting.
Yeah,
Ben-Gurion, what was it about Rabin that you think that made Ben-Gurion?
Rabin was not very partisan. I mean, he was roughly identified with Ahadut Avodah, but he was not.
He wasn't a political person.
He was not a political person. That I don't think that bothered Ben-Gurion, but the rivalry with Peres began then. Peres did not want him to be chief of staff and tried to speak to Ben-Gurion against it. And they had differences of opinion on the orientation of Israel, European or American. And Peres was very much for a European orientation, France, Germany. And Rabin said, no, the main arena is the United States. This is where we should be looking at. And there were differences of opinion on the nuclear issue. Ahadut Avodah in general, and Rabin too, were hesitant about having a nuclear option.
Right. And when we talk about Shimon Peres in later weeks, we'll hear more about Peres' involvement in that, because of course he was instrumental in making,
not just instrumental, he was the father of the bomb.
Father of the nuclear bomb. Yeah.
The bomb we don't have.
Right. I was going to say the alleged, according to foreign sources.
Yeah.
So Rabin, when he leaves service, he becomes ambassador to the United States. and just looking at it, from the outside, he seems a strange choice to become prime minister after Golda quits in '74, because he's not, as you said, he's not particularly political. He hasn't had any ministerial role. What was behind that decision for Rabin to be the candidate for prime minister?
First of all, he wanted to remain in public life. Once you were chief of staff, the only way to remain in public life is to go into politics. Let's say, when I ended my ambassadorship in Washington, I had to think of next steps. Said if I wanted to be foreign minister, I had to go into politics. You don't become foreign minister if you're not in politics. So decided not to go into politics. But he decided to go into politics. So he joined the Labour Party. But prior to that, he went to Eshkol. And Eshkol said, so what would you like to do now? He said, I'd like to be ambassador in Washington. Eshkol was very surprised, because when you thought of the stereotype of a diplomat, Rabin did not fit it. So, but the reason that Rabin wanted to be ambassador in Washington was he said, I'm in a way provincial. I grew up here. I never studied abroad. I don't know the world. If I want to be an influential, significant political figure, I have to understand the world, and the place to understand the world is in Washington. Wow. So I would like to be ambassador in Washington. It so happened that when he arrived in Washington, he met Henry Kissinger, who was National Security Advisor, and they became fast friends.
Right.
And Kissinger became his mentor, both in American politics and international politics. And that created a very firm bond between the two men. Now, Rabin was actually a very effective ambassador in Washington. The relationship with Kissinger brought him to Nixon. So if you're the ambassador in Washington, you have open door to the National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State, Kissinger, and through him to the president.
Especially,
half of your job.
Especially an unusually influential National Security Advisor.
Right. So he became a very effective ambassador. Second, the Americans were then in the Vietnam syndrome, and very unhappy with the fact that they were unable to defeat the Viet Cong in Vietnam. And here comes an ambassador, a military hero, the man who was chief of staff during an amazing military victory for Israel. Everybody wants to hear from that military hero and successful commander-in-chief about stuff. So people wanted to hear him, people wanted to meet him. He worked on, his English was not great when he arrived. It never became great, it became workable. But he was effective enough to be both on the media and in personal communication.
And then at the end of his service, he returns to Israel. And again, there's this, on the face of it, quite surprising leap from, there aren't many people that go from ambassador to the
Not directly. So first of all, he became, first of all, the fact that he came back to Israel before the October debacle, but he had nothing to do with it. So when Golda and Moshe Dayan resigned in '74, and Labor had to choose a successor for Golda, there were two contenders, Shimon Peres and Rabin. Rabin was attractive to many members because he was, after a military defeat, an untarnished, great general, and and a successful ambassador to Washington, so with an international aroma, and that gave him an edge of 60-40 over Peres, and he won. It was decided in party center, several hundred votes. He got 60%, Peres got 40%. So he became an unelected prime minister.
Right, because the election Golda had already won the election in '74, and he replaced her as prime minister. Right. And then he's in office until '77, until he resigns before that election, which we'll get to. one thing I do want to mention, not least because we just had the 50th anniversary of Entebbe, that was Rabin was prime minister during this dramatic, historic moment.
Right.
How do you see his role in that?
Okay, that's another controversial issue between Rabin and Peres.
Yes.
No, I know you hosted Miki Barzor, who wrote also the Peres biography.
He's coming back to talk about Peres, actually.
Yeah, talk about Peres. So you should also raise Entebbe with him. I went to speak to Miki Barzor, that I'm friendly with, when I wrote the Rabin biography, and we also spoke about that. So Rabin actually, as prime minister, 2 or 3 days into the event, said, "Why aren't we doing anything? Where is the IDF? Where are the plans?" So on and so forth. But then, going back to what Ben-Gurion said about the hesitant Rabin, before he approved the operation, it was not a simple thing. I mean, you send the creme de la creme to a place like Uganda, and if you fail, it becomes a huge national disaster. So he wanted to be sure 120% that everything was fine.
Yeah.
And he, until the last moment, he actually only when the planes were in the air, he gave the final approval. And again, classic for Rabin, he deposited a letter of resignation with a legal advisor and said, if it fails, I resign.
Wow. That's a great example, by the way. We call this series "The Buck Stops Here," on the idea that the prime minister is at the top of the tree, and that's a great example of that, I think.
Nice to think about it nowadays.
I may no comment.
No, you don't.
But that's a great example with Rabin. And again, actually, another example. He resigns before the 1977 election because of what now seems like a pretty minor transgression of his wife having a private bank account in the United States, which was undeclared. So he quits. Peres runs as the Labour Party candidate, and of course loses to Menachem Begin, which in this center is a big deal, of course. And then Rabin's in the opposition, but he comes back when the unity government, which you mentioned before, when Shamir and Peres are together in the unity government, Rabin serves as defense minister.
Yeah, but before we get to that, so he is first of all, his first tenure was not so great. I mean, there was one major achievement. That's the interim agreement with Egypt, 1975, and more important even, the series of agreements with the United States that supplemented that agreement, which in a way laid the basis for peace with Egypt. You cannot understand what happened in 1977 and on without the 1975 interim agreement with Egypt. That was the crowning achievement of his term. But he was bedeviled by the rivalry with Peres. He thought that he should give, since Peres got 40% of the vote, he should give him something meaningful, and he gave him the Ministry of Defense. The Ministry of Defense is a very powerful ministry with a lot of power and influence, and the rivalry between them bedeviled his first term. And Rabin did not remain passive. After he left power, he wrote his memoirs, in which he was very sharp against Peres.
Do you think he thought then that he might come back as prime minister, or you don't think that?
I don't think he was that optimistic at that point, but he wanted to come back, and including Rabin, who was not considered a great speaker or writer, had a way of coining very effective phrases. And he called Peres in the memoirs, he said, I'll say in Hebrew and then I'll translate it, Chatran bilti nil'eh, indefatigable intriguer. That sort of stuck to Peres. He called Yossi Beilin Peres' poodle. also stuck to Berlin for many years. That he had this, the man who was not very eloquent, he had the way of coining a phrase that stuck to individuals or to groups. So he sort of expunged this unhappy experience through the memoir. Then he tried to compete with Peres and failed, and eventually came to understand that they should find a way of living together. Peres being number one and he being number two, throughout the 1980s until 1992. It is not very well known that they had a go-between. A man called Yoa Aini, not a very well-known figure. He happens to be my in-law, but he worked in the Trade Union Federation as a lawyer, but he had the confidence of both Rabin and Peres. And whenever there was a crisis between the two of them, he was a go-between. He used to try to cushion and to mediate, and he did that very effectively from the early 1980s until the assassination for many years. And it remained, as you could see, that the first time you hear the name, he's not very well known, but he was a very important figure behind the scenes in Israel during these years. And later on, he played a similar role between Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak. Yeah.
I mean, apart from the obvious personal animosity between them, were there significant political differences, or did they have a particular, I mean, as time would go on into the 80s, into the 90s, the Labour Party moved towards the idea of some kind of settlement with the Palestinians or whatever, which hadn't been the case before. But was Peres moving more quickly? Was Rabin more hawkish? How did that play out?
Actually, Peres used to be very hawkish.
Right, in the 70s, as defense minister, right.
And he was actually, in Elon Moreh, I think, there's a tree which commemorates his support. There was one of their most bitter clashes was around the question of Sebastia, with the settlement, with the settlers, and what Peres did for them, and Rabin was very angry, and so. Right. So Rabin was not considered to be very dovish, and during the Intifada, the first Intifada, to break the bones. He was,
this is when he was defense minister.
Very tough, but actually, having said break the bones, he came to the conclusion that we had to look for an accommodation because he didn't think that it was a long-term prospect to just continue to rule the West Bank.
So let's get to that. So he's elected in '92 as prime minister, and I mean our audience here will know the Oslo process starts a year later. But the story that most of us know is that this was done obviously, secretly. Initially not with Rabin's knowledge, then Rabin found out about it and gave it the green light. But how do you understand Rabin's approach to the Oslo process? Because one of the things I think with Rabin, a bit like Begin actually, is that people of different political dispositions interpret Rabin in their own way, right? So some people will say, some people on the left will sort of talk about him as the great peacemaker and say, if if Rabin had lived, if there hadn't been the assassination, we would have had peace. And other people further to the right will say, no, actually Rabin was much more hawkish than you're giving him credit for. He actually never really supported a Palestinian state in the way that you on the left now talk about it. How do you read Rabin's approach to Oslo and the peace process?
Yeah, actually. When we were discussing, I'm active in the Rabin Center in Tel Aviv, and there was a time when people thought that the legacy should be defined as Oslo. And I said, by no means no, including Rabin actually did not like Oslo. I'll come to that in a minute. I think the legacy should be leadership, not or statesmanship, not Oslo. Now, Rabin was determined to move on in the peace process. I mean, the peace process was begun by the Bush-Baker administration after the first Gulf War. They decided that it was both an opportune moment and mandatory to try to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. The United States was in a unique position, having no Soviet Union, a sole superpower, having just demonstrated in the first Gulf War what it could do for its friends, and said, let's use this unique moment in order to try to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. So they convened a peace conference in Madrid, and there were 4 tracks: Israel, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians under Jordan. Now,
this is still during the Shamir Prime Minister.
Yeah, and Shamir was not very keen on this, and dragged his feet. Nothing much happened. Then Rabin is elected, and Rabin decides, well, we have a peace process. We should put life into it because we need to. The way he put it is this: our real challenge is not these immediate neighbors, but the enemies in the east, Iran and Iraq. This was still Iraq of Saddam Hussein and Iran. There's no need to elaborate. Okay, so he said, what we need to do is dual containment. To contain these two, but in order to contain them effectively, we have to sort out our relationship with our immediate neighbors. So we should begin with that. Now, where do you begin? Two partners could not be the first: Jordan and Lebanon. Jordan is a conservative monarchy; it cannot be the first. Lebanon was under Syrian control, no question. So it could be either Syria or the Palestinians. So who do you prefer? Actually, Rabin, well, it's called devil's choice, because if you go with Syria and you make peace with Syria, you have to get off the Golan Heights. If you make peace with the Palestinians or with the PLO, swallowing a bitter pill, you'll have to give up much of the West Bank. Both very painful. Anyway, he preferred Syria. He said, Syria is a state. It has a strong leader. It sounds a bit ironic now, but Hafez al-Assad was a strong leader, and actually a reliable leader in the sense that we signed the 1974 accord with Syria at the end of the October War, and he kept it to the letter. So, and what do you have on the Palestinian side? You have the PLO, which is not a state, it's an organization. You have Yasser Arafat, who was very unreliable. And of course, you have the underlying national conflict, which is very difficult to resolve. So his preference was Syria. But we had a problem with Syria. Assad. The same Assad was very difficult to negotiate with. And Assad, I was a negotiator, said, okay, I'm here in a peace process. I'm willing to make peace, but I will not tell you what peace means before you commit to full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. And our response was, you don't begin a negotiation with the bottom line. We're not telling you that we'll not get there, but we'll not begin a negotiation with that. So there's a whole route that you have to go in order to get there. So we are stuck. We are stuck. And in the meantime, there begins what we call the Oslo Channel. Because in Washington, the negotiations with the Palestinian delegation were not going forward in any way. And therefore, the alternative track began in Oslo. So it was not hidden for a long time from Rabin. Yossi Beilin and his people began it. After a couple of weeks, they told Peres, and after a couple of weeks, Peres told Rabin. So Rabin knew about it from fairly early on, and he gave them a green light. This was, again, one of Rabin's qualities. He said, if I'm stuck and there are other options, I will not eliminate them. So, okay, see what this leads to.
Right.
And on March 1, he gave another green light. He allowed Uri Savir, who was Director General of the Foreign Ministry, to become the negotiator in Oslo, which now became official. With the Director General of the Foreign Ministry. He was never sure that they shared everything with him. He was suspicious by nature. Tell you another story. So he and I had, at that point, a very close personal relationship. And I used to come very often from Washington to Israel, land at Ben Gurion Airport, get a rented car, go to Jerusalem, and go to see Rabin. That day he was busy hosting, I think, Prime Minister Major or somebody else. So he asked me to come see him later in the evening. So I went to see Peres. Oh, I come at 10 o'clock to see him at home, and he says, so when did you arrive? I said, this afternoon. And what have you done since then? He said, I went to see Shimon Peres. He smiled and said, I know. Oh, yeah. So he was suspicious that Peres and company were not telling him everything about Oslo, that there may have been verbal communication that he was not aware of. And he did not like Oslo. So here we come to, I think, the most interesting chapter in all of this, or not chapter, story. So we are in early August 1993. And Oslo basically is sketched as an agreement about to be signed, initial sign. We are stuck with Syria, cannot overcome this issue. Secretary of State Christopher comes to Jerusalem, and he comes to see Rabin. Now, every meeting at that level, President and Prime Minister, Secretary of State, Prime Minister, you have what you call a small meeting and a larger meeting. Small meeting is one-on-one, which always is two-on-two, because there will be note-takers. So in this meeting, it's Christopher and Dennis Ross and Rabin and myself sitting in his office. And there is a group of about 8 others waiting in the meeting room. And normally the small meeting takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes. This one took more than half an hour. Why? Because Rabin suddenly says to Christopher, when you go to Damascus tomorrow, ask Assad, if he gets what he wants, will he give me what I want? Which is what you call in diplomacy or in the theory of negotiation, the hypothetical question technique. So you have an honest broker,
right,
and you ask a hypothetical question. The honest broker knows the answers, and he sees whether a deal could be made. So he asks him a hypothetical question, which implies that in theory or hypothetically he's willing to withdraw from the Golan Heights, and then he begins to elaborate to Christopher. He says, and basically, and this comes back to Begin, because he sketches more or less the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty with some differences. So I'll say here in brackets, he had great respect for Begin, and he knew that in a way he was walking in his footsteps.
Right.
And so, and he says to Christopher, okay, so this is what I have in mind. Full withdrawal in 5 months, no evacuation of settlements in the first phase. I want a lot of normalization up front so that we can build support for the deal in the Israeli public and so on. And then he says to him 2 things. One is, this is, of course, very secret. If it comes out, it's non-existent. Number 2, this should be in your pocket. It must not be on the table. Which he meant is, don't tell Assad everything that I told you. Now, this was, unfortunately, totally destroyed by Christopher. Because Christopher goes to Damascus, and a day later he comes to Jerusalem. The 4 of us meet again, and he says, I have good news. Assad is interested in principle. But, he said, not 5 years, 6 months. Normalization, he doesn't like this word because the Arabic term for normalization comes from the coaching of horses. It's insulting. Security arrangements, Syria is the victim, you're the offender. And so we understand immediately that he
put everything out.
Did not become. Right. Now, I can just imagine that if the Secretary of State would be Jim Baker or Henry Kissinger, what they would have done is would have told Assad, You know, I saw Rabin yesterday. I think I'm beginning to see some change.
Yeah.
Give me something to take back.
They would have
You know,
kept it
he would have
hypothetical.
shuttled for a month and would have done the deal because he had in his pocket the fact that he could, that Rabin was ready for full withdrawal. And, you know, as we were walking out of this Rabin's office into the larger room, I said to Dennis Ross, you know, I don't like big phrases, but I could hear the wings of history in the room because Rabin just gave him the key to make peace between Israel and Syria. And it was completely destroyed by Christopher. Rabin understood that he could not object to Oslo now because there was nothing he could put on the table. Syria is out of, and he agreed to go to Oslo.
Wow.
So that's so unwillingly.
So, wow, it's an interesting counterfactual. So if things, a different Secretary of State, you think could have been peace with Syria, withdraw from the Golan Heights, and people have different views about that, but peace with Syria, and then we wouldn't have gone into the Oslo process.
Right.
Wow.
No, Christopher asked him, if you make the deal with Syria, he knew something big. They used, at the time, Yossi Beilin used to brief Daniel Kerzer, who eventually became ambassador here, on what was going on in Oslo. So the Americans had an idea of what was going on in Oslo. So Christopher asked him, what about this agreement on Gaza first? So Rabin said, if we make the deal with Syria, it's going to be just Gaza.
Interesting.
And in his mind, he said, if I make a deal with Syria and the Palestinians remain alone and very weak, I could then make a very, very good bargain with the Palestinians. That was in his mind.
So as time goes on, so as Oslo develops, and then you get the Oslo II agreements and with Israeli military withdrawals from parts of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and how, in your reading, how is Rabin seeing this? Is he looking at this and seeing this as a hopeful, as a kind of progress towards some eventual two-state solution, or is he looking at it somewhat, I don't know, to go back to what Ben Gurion said about him, somewhat apprehensively, somewhat cautiously?
Well, he, some things, let's say, if you work for the prime minister and you are a diplomat, let's say, some questions you don't ask.
Sure.
You will not get them. But so there is a bit of a dark area, but more or less you know the direction. So I never asked him, what is your ultimate idea about the Palestinians? He gave a speech in the Knesset after Oslo II, and in which he said, Palestinian entity less than a state. Less than a state.
Yeah.
So now, whether he really meant it, or whether, this was the one bargaining chip that he had vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So why give it away?
Yeah.
So he kept it as a bargaining chip, the whole idea of statehood. Whether he understood or thought that it was inevitable, or whether he thought that they would have to settle on less than a state, I don't know.
Right, it's interesting. Also, less than a state, that can be interpreted different ways. You could say that, when many years ago Netanyahu talked about a demilitarized Palestinian state, that could also be seen as, some people would say that's less than a state, right? A demilitarized state or something like that.
Well, Netanyahu spoke during the Obama years. He did speak about
the Bar Ilan speech.
In the Bar Ilan speech. But this was then.
Sure. Obviously things change, but that less than a state could mean different things. I want to get to questions from the audience. Before I do, let me just ask you, people play with these counterfactuals all the time. Are you someone who thinks that had Rabin
been assassinated,
if he continued, Peres wasn't prime minister, Rabin fights that election, what do you think happens? Or do you not? Or are you someone who thinks we don't play these games?
Well, first of all, Rabin had to win the election of 96. And actually, Netanyahu was doing quite well in the polls.
Right.
So we don't know how that
Right.
would have
His
been.
Hamas-
I think
suicide bombing from
ultimately,
Hamas.
I think ultimately he would have won. I'm not sure that he would have come to an agreement with Arafat, but so what happened, the second intifada and so forth, I think he would have managed it differently and there would be no second intifada. I mean, I think he would have managed the crisis of disagreement with Arafat in a different way.
Okay. Well, obviously we'll never know, but I think that it's one of those interesting questions, and clearly that moment in November '95, the assassination is one of the hinge moments in Israeli history. Okay, I think I have a colleague with a microphone at the back. So a gentleman already has his hand up, and I'll come to you afterwards. Yeah, if you can. Wait a second. So hello? If one of you can just get the microphone to this gentleman in the middle here with his hand up. Okay, בסדר גמור. תדליק אותו. Okay, so if you just speak loudly and then I'm going to repeat it Can you stand up? Maybe we'll hear better.
Yeah. I actually had very high regard for Leah. Of course, no one is perfect, but she was, first of all, strong-willed, had strong opinions, very well educated. She read a lot. She loved art and understood art. And she was a very good partner for him in mediating between him and the world, because he was a bit of a recluse. He sort of became more and more liberated over time, but she was a good interpreter between him and the world. But he did not let her push too far or intervene too far, and there was a moment when he said, "Leah, die." I witnessed that several times. So, yeah.
Okay. There's some, if you can come down with that, just a second. Greer, can you stick your hand up so she can see who you are? Yeah, great.
Professor Rabinovich, how do you think history would have evolved if Rabin had not been assassinated?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, actually,
that was the question I asked at the end, I think.
How
is it different? No, but is it different to how? Because I asked that question. Yeah, that was the.
Yeah.
Not really. It would have been different because
No,
parents would never have been.
I think, as I replied earlier, I think he had, first of all, there had to be the beginning of the final status negotiations in 99. The agreement with the Palestinians was finally confirmed in 94. After 5 years, there was to be the beginning of final status negotiation, which would be 99. And whether this negotiation would have been successful or no, I don't know. They may very well have ended in a crisis. And I said earlier, I think that the crisis of 99 would not have unfolded like the crisis of 2000 with the second intifada. He would have conducted it better.
Okay. This gentleman here in the front row. And then I see lots of hands up, don't worry, I'll get to you.
Good evening. Thank you, first of all, for a very informative presentation. How would you, since we're at the Begin Center, how would you describe the evolving relationship, which I think there was between Begin and Rabin? And if there was an evolving relationship, what are the factors that took place since the time of the Alitalia and then forward from there?
There wasn't a particularly significant personal relationship between the two of them. I should mention here Rabin's role with Altalena. This is an interesting and, in my mind, disturbing story because there is an effort on parts of the Israeli right wing in a way to, quote unquote, justify the assassination with the fact that Rabin participated in not the sinking of Altalena, but in the fighting that took place on the beach in Tel Aviv. So, in a way, killed Jews and therefore had to be killed as a sort of revenge. This is very twisted and crooked, but you hear that. You hear that sometimes in what I call the hallucinatory right wing in Israel. Now, what happened actually on that day? How did Rabin find himself on the beach? He went to visit Leah, who was his girlfriend, in the headquarters of the Palmach, which were close to the beach. And then there was people in the Palmach were alerted to the beach because fighting took place on the beach, and he was there. He did not sink Altalena. Altalena was sunk by artillery at Ben-Gurion's command. And the senior figure there was Yigal Alon and not Rabin. Rabin did not play an important role in that incident, but as I said, in a very twisted way, after the assassination, it was an effort to make him, to depict him as a major player and to try to cast blame on him and in a way, I say in a crooked way, to justify the assassination. You find that. If you want, you can do, I think it should be somewhere on the network, if you go to there is an annual commemoration for the victims of the Irgun on that day, and there are some of the speeches that are being made even in recent years, even to date, do make a reference to Rabin in that context. I think this is a very unfortunate turn of events.
Okay.
But no, so yeah, and Rabin, I said, I once wrote an essay on 3 Israeli leaders who went against their grain. I think that in order to become not just a leader but a statesman, you have to be able to go against your grain in order to make the right decision for your country. And the 3 leaders who went against their grain were Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon. Menachem Begin, when he made peace with Egypt and he gave up the Sinai. Rabin, when he went to Oslo, and Sharon when he went out of Gaza, the father of the settlements, and other Gaza and on the northern West Bank. So being able to go against Ukraine is, I think, an essential quality for a statesman. And Rabin appreciated the fact that Begin did that, and in a way took inspiration from him. And I indicated earlier, his vision of what an Israeli-Syrian peace agreement would look like was copied from the Israeli-Egyptian peace made by Menachem Begin.
Okay. Yeah, gentleman here. Just wait for the mic.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for your reflections. It's very appreciated. I just wanted to ask about something that has often been talked about with Prime Minister Rabin, which is his drinking issue, and how that affected or how exaggerated it may have been. But any comments are
Did you get that?
drinking,
Yeah.
ishkoti.
The claim that Rabin drank a lot.
Ah,
That exaggerated.
Yeah. Well, since I used to spend time with the Rabins when they visited Washington, either in the hotel room or in a hotel suite or in Blair House, I used to see the whiskey bottle in the evening, and I used to see it when I came in the morning. It was a bit lower, but not much. Rabin, I never saw Rabin drink a lot. By the way, Shimon Peres also, we used to, Peres, I had, being the ambassador and negotiator, I was sandwiched between Rabin and Peres, and their rivalry. It was not always very comfortable. But I kept my good relationship with Peres. And when he used to visit, we used to sit in the evening and drink wine, or he also liked to drink cognac. He drank not heavily and was never intoxicated. So, having a reasonable amount of alcohol, I think, is good for you.
Definitely. I'm not gonna say anything about that, but yes, I agree. Let's go to this side, this gentleman here with the glasses.
A little off topic from the general discussion, but what is your view of the current regime in Syria? And how do you think they view what's going on between Israel and Lebanon right now?
Your view of the current regime.
Current
in
regime,
Syria.
I got that. So it's got nothing to do with Rabin, but it's an interesting issue, so let me say something about it. So it's, first of all, it was very good for us that the Assads fell and Iran lost Syria as a major aspect of its, or major component of its axis of evil. Now, Ashara, when he came to power, Giuliani was then called, raised a lot of questions inside Syria and outside Syria. Is he still the jihadi that he used to be because he was in Al-Qaeda? Or did he become a responsible statesman? And my answer is that he is not a jihadi. He's no longer a jihadi. He ceased being a jihadi in 2016. And he was the autonomous prime minister of a whole province in Syria for several years called Idlib in northwestern Syria. And he managed himself very well in that role. He is what I call today a pragmatic Islamist. He's an Islamist, and he wants Syria to be controlled today by the Muslim Sunni majority, not by the minorities, the Alawites, the Druze, so forth. But he's a pragmatic statement. And take the most recent example. When President Trump was given the strange idea that Syria should send its troops to Lebanon to fight Hezbollah, I said, by no means. He needs to consolidate his rule in Syria, and he won't get into foreign adventures. So I think that we could manage our relationship with him in a better way. We should restore the D word into our policy. D word means diplomacy, not by force alone, but also with diplomacy. And I think if we manage after the elections to create sort of an axis between us, the current Syrian regime, and the government of Lebanon, it would be a major, major achievement.
Well, okay. Yeah, this gentleman here.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your time tonight. Based on your experience with Rabin and your friendship with him, how do you think he would understand and approach Israel's current geopolitical situation today and its current relationship with the United States?
What was the last bit? Its current
And its current
relationship
relationship with the United
How would
States.
Rabin today?
Yeah.
If you could imagine it. Yeah.
I don't think the relationship with the United States with Rabin as leader would have deteriorated to the present situation. This is not something that began today. I think there's been a deliberate policy run by Netanyahu and Dermer for quite a few years. First, to regard the fundamentalists in the United States as more important to Israel than the Jewish community. And secondly, to prefer the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. It was always a tenet of Israeli policy in the United States to work with both sides of the aisle. Sometimes the Republicans in power, sometimes the Democrats in power. It should be mandatory for us to cultivate relationship with both. So in a way, we are reaping now the negative harvest of many years. This was very much aggravated by the relationship with Trump. You know, on the one hand, it looked like a great achievement to harness Trump to our effort to destroy the Iranian nuclear and so forth and so forth. But who did we go in bed with? We went to bed with somebody who is completely unreliable, who can change his mind overnight. So when the war turned out to be a failure rather than a success, and Trump began to think about the November election, so forth and so forth, he immediately indicated that he wants out. When he decided he wants out, the Iranians understood that they can get almost everything out of him. And he gives them almost everything, including the linkage between Lebanon and Iran. That was never the case. To link South Lebanon to the Hormuz Strait, you know, it's a disaster for us. So I don't think under Rabin we would have gotten into this position, not 10 years ago and not 6 months ago.
Okay. Just if 1, 2, well, okay, 3, 4, goodness me. Okay, I'm not sure we'll get to everyone, but let's see. Let's have this lady in the front row. We haven't heard from a woman in a while.
We long time associate Bibi Netanyahu to the security. Can you tell us if Rabin was concerned by the minority and the people defavorized? Because I don't remember that he did something special.
That he was concerned with what, sorry?
We know that Bibi Netanyahu was preoccupied many years about the security of the country. Okay. But can he tell us if Rabin was preoccupied and concerned by the minority of the people, if he was concerned by the defavorized people?
The minority of the people?
Yeah, people, you know, who are not comfortable financially. Because okay. I don't remember that he did something
okay. So if Rabin,
drastic.
Okay, if Rabin was concerned with the sort of more less well-off members of society, if that was something that motivated him, if he was, or peripheral parts of the country.
Yeah, Rabin actually. The Rabin government, the second Rabin government, made very large investments in infrastructure, in education, and in the Arab sector. The Arabs never forgave him for his harsh words during the Intifada, break the bones, but they regard this period as the golden period in the relationship with the government. But by and large, you know, Rabin was not somebody who thought primarily of socioeconomic issues, but about national security, both in the military and in the diplomatic sense of the term. It was not, you know, you say about Lyndon Johnson that he was a huge failure in Vietnam, but a great president domestically. It was not Rabin's emphasis.
Thank you. Okay, gentleman at the front.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Ambassador. You mentioned that Prime Minister Rabin was inspired by the Camp David Accords that Begin was able to make with Egypt. But there's a conventional wisdom that's floating out there that it was the opposite, that Begin had to give everything away to Sadat in order to secure the deal. and that there was really no negotiation, so that when the Oslo Accords came along, Rabin was forced to also give away everything because we really didn't get anything from Sadat.
Okay. I think Begin miscalculated in the sense that he thought that he would get from Sadat both full peace with Egypt and security regime, which he did. Of course, the most important breakthrough in our relationship with the Arab world. But he also thought that Sadat was willing to abandon the Palestinian issue, which he was not. And he realized that later, 81, 82, when we were fighting with the PLO from South Lebanon, not very successfully, and he was quite desperate about that. And then Sharon gave him what looked like the formula is that we'll go into war in Lebanon and we'll change the whole reality in the region, which ended up, of course, being a disaster. And since he was an honest man with integrity, he could not live with that. And that led to his period of seclusion, which preceded his death. The last period of his life was very tragic because he was an honest man who realized that the Lebanon war, not the peace with Egypt, but the Lebanon war was a great mistake. But he miscalculated in believing that what he would get from Sadat was not just peace with Egypt, but also a willingness by Egypt to abandon the Palestinian issue, which was not the case.
Okay, gentleman here in the middle. Just can you wait for the mic so that we can hear it on the recording? Sorry, I just want to make sure that people watching this on YouTube or on our podcast can hear.
Good evening, and thank you for your time, Ambassador. There's a term in America, in English, called strange bedfellows. The ability for Rabin to form a coalition with Shlomi Aloni and Rav Yosef really is commendable for him. But I always wonder, going forward in the next election, whether the left of center party will be able to get any religious voters to side with them, the way Shas was able to form a coalition with Rabin in 1992.
Wait,
so my question projects.
He's asking about the next election.
Right, but so the question is,
going forward in the next election, will any left of religious vote
compared to
your predictions for the next election, knowing what you've seen between the Rav Yosef and Shlomi Aloni?
Yeah. Well, remember that in the beginning, Shas went with Rabin, and that gave him the majority for Oslo. That was a different Shas and a different Deri. Yeah. Today Deri is very different. Now, to get Oslo II, they had to obtain the support of the Mitsubishi of Goldfarb. They gave Goldfarb from Raful, I think Raful's party, the deputy ministership, and so he got a car, a Mitsubishi. It was known negatively as the Goldfarb's Mitsubishi. Yeah, it was very difficult to get Oslo II confirmed. You know, every leader needs a fixer. Begin actually was a very good fixer himself. I don't think he needed one. He had Kadishai and other people, but he dominated completely the politics of his own movement. Ben-Gurion had a man called Shraga Netzer, who made sure that he was in control of the party and the coalition making and so forth. Rabin had people like Sheves and Baiga Shochat and other people who did lots of that politics for himself, although Rabin of the second term is not Rabin of the first term. He learned how to become more of a politician. Now, this is absolutely out of scope for this meeting, but if you ask me about the next election, if let's say the center left ends up with 59 and Netanyahu and the coalition end up with 54, 55, and Herzog would invite Eisenkot to try to form a government. He could form a minority government with support from the outside by the Arabs, not have them join the coalition. And in time, the expectation would be that others would join in, but this is completely speculative, and I never said it.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Yes, lady here. Just Isha Zot. There's a microphone on the way. Yeah. Can you stick your hand up so my colleague can see you? Yeah. Great.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to go back to the 90s and the discussion about Rabin, Paris, and so forth. I remember it well. There are probably a lot of people in this audience who remember a lot of bus bombings were going on during the same period that the great efforts were being made to negotiate a peace with the Palestinians. I wonder if Rabin, how much of a factor was the great fear in the society and in the electorate that they were negotiating with with a unreliable liar.
Right.
And people were paying with their lives for it. It's a sociological issue about two politicians and statesmen. Was it a factor, and how much of a factor was it?
Okay, so you're talking about, so to what extent was the terrorism, including the suicide bombings in
Yes.
Israel during the Oslo period, to what extent did they impact Rabin and Peres's decision-making? How much did they think about it? How much?
A lot. And it was, when you ask yourself, why did Oslo fail? The terrorism, which was inspired by Syria and by Iran. Remember the current regime in Iran came to power in 1979. And since 1982, they were in Lebanon through Hezbollah. And they were supporters. Hamas was formed in 1987, had support from Iran early on. So this was their way. Now you ask me, what about Syria? Yes, Syria played this double game. It negotiated with Israel and it cultivated terrorism. And first of all, Rabin, Peres, and other, they were all human beings. They were all very much affected by the horror scenes of what happened in buses and in other places. And secondly, they understood very well that this was undermining support for Israel. Rabin coined the term Korbanot HaShalom, the victims of peace, that didn't go down very well in the Israeli public. So this was maybe the single most important element in undermining Oslo.
Right. Let's have one last question. Okay, this gentleman here has had his hand up for a while. Apologies for those that didn't get their questions asked. Yes, sir.
Hi.
Make it a good one, no pressure.
It's a good one. The ongoing rivalry between Peres and Rabin, to what extent did it affect their political judgment? How much of a personal agenda did either of them have, which actually made for poor decision-making?
Okay, from my not just experience in real politics, but from my work as a historian, that political leaders never distinguish between the interest of the state and their own personal success, because that I'm so essential for the state to be successful that my own personal fortunes cannot be separated from the interest of the state. So they tend to identify their own personal success with the welfare or success of the nation. And I think they don't see any dissonance between the two.
And specifically the relationship, the tension between Peres and Rabin, did that impact their decision making?
It did. But the two of them communicated surprisingly well. I said through the mediator and directly, which surprised people. When I told you the story before that I went to see Peres and Rabin asked me, he knew from Peres that I went to see him because they did speak all the time. But the rivalry was always there, including, by the way, on the podium in the event that preceded the assassination. They still had a very tough argument over the future of an organization called Nativ. Nativ is the organization that dealt with the Jews in the Soviet Union.
Right.
Where would it be? The Foreign Ministry or in the Prime Minister's office? And they actually, not very well known, they signed an agreement between the two of them that settled their relationship with a view to the future government. I have a copy of that agreement.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you'll agree, ladies and gentlemen, we've learned a huge amount. Itamar Rabinovich, it's been a real pleasure having you with us and educating us and informing us. This series continues actually not until the end of the month. The 26th of July is the next event where of course we'll be discussing Menachem Begin. So please come for that, of course. If you're not on my mailing list, send me an email, paulg@begincenter.org.il, and you'll get all the English events straight into your mailbox. It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for coming. Good evening. Bye.